New Year's Eve had always been an unremarkable night for me. The fireworks, the crowds, the shallow resolutions, none of it held any appeal. That night was no different. I wandered through the empty streets of my small town, the faint echoes of distant celebrations muffled by the bitter cold. The streetlights overhead flickered erratically, their golden glow struggling to push back the encroaching darkness. I turned the corner near the old train station, drawn by no particular purpose, just the hope that walking might clear my mind. That's when I saw him. The man was standing beneath the last working street lamp, a black coat hanging loosely over his bony frame. His hat brim cast a shadow that obscured his face, but his posture seemed wrong, too rigid, as though his body was being held up by invisible strings. In his gloved hand, he clutched a small stack of tickets. "One-way ticket to nowhere," he murmured as I approached. His voice was raspy, barely audible over the faint hum of the streetlight. "Excuse me?" I asked, stopping in my tracks. He tilted his head slightly, and though I couldn't see his eyes, I felt the weight of his gaze, sharp and probing. Without waiting for a response, he extended one of the tickets toward me. The card was yellowed, its edges frayed like an artifact from another era. Embossed in faded gold letters were the words, "Midnight train to nowhere, all aboard." I should have walked away. A voice in my mind screamed at me to turn back, to keep moving, but my fingers reached for the ticket as if compelled by something unseen. The moment I touched it, the man turned abruptly and began walking away, disappearing into the shadows before I could utter another word. I stood there, staring at the strange ticket in my hand. The distant whistle of a train broke the silence, startling me. Against my better judgment, I turned toward the station. The building was an anachronism, a relic of a bygone age. Its facade was cracked, and the paint peeled like dead skin. A single platform stretched out beyond the station, shrouded in fog that clung to the tracks like a living thing. I should have felt the cold, but as I stepped onto the platform, a strange warmth enveloped me. The air was thick, heavy with a metallic tang that clung to the back of my throat. The train stood waiting, its massive black engine exhaling tendrils of steam. The windows of its carriages were fogged, the faint glow of dim lamps barely visible within. The open door of the nearest carriage loomed ahead, beckoning. The platform was silent, devoid of the usual clamor of passengers or conductors. Even the air seemed still, as though the world was holding its breath. I hesitated for only a moment before stepping aboard. The interior of the train was far more opulent than I had expected. Deep red velvet lined the seats, and brass fixtures adorned the walls, their surfaces tarnished, yet still gleaming faintly in the dim light. A faint aroma of aged wood and something floral lingered in the air, faintly masking an underlying smell I couldn't place. Something metallic, like rust or blood. I chose a seat by the window, my back pressed firmly against the plush upholstery. Through the glass, I could see nothing but darkness, the fog too thick to discern any landmarks. The other passengers caught my attention next. There were perhaps a dozen scattered throughout the carriage, but they sat unnaturally still, their faces turned away or hidden behind hats and veils. Those who weren't obscured seemed off. One man clutched a newspaper, but his hands trembled as though struggling to hold the pages steady. A woman across from me wore a faded black gown, her fingers adorned with rings that caught the light as she absent-mindedly stroked the edge of her seat. It wasn't just their appearance, it was the air around them. A faint distortion, like heat rising off asphalt, surrounded each figure, blurring their edges. And their movements, when they did shift, it was quick, jerky, as if each motion required immense effort. First time. The voice jolted me. I turned to see the woman in the black gown watching me now, her pale lips curved into a faint smile. Yes, I stammered, unsure of how to respond. Her smile widened, revealing teeth that were unnervingly sharp. It's always unsettling at first, she said, her voice low and melodic. She leaned forward slightly, her gaze piercing. You'll get used to it, eventually. Before I could respond, the train lurched forward, and I was pressed back into my seat. The movement felt unnatural, not the steady rumble of a typical locomotive, but something smoother, almost fluid, as if the train wasn't gliding over tracks, but through something denser, something alive. I turned back to the window, but the view outside offered no solace. Instead of passing scenery, I saw fleeting images, fragments of places I recognized but couldn't place, scenes from my past that flashed by like forgotten dreams. A playground dusted with snow, a crumbling church where sunlight filtered through broken stained glass. Each image lingered just long enough to stir something within me. Nostalgia mingled with unease. Then, as quickly as they appeared, they dissolved into the void. A shiver ran through me. I glanced back at the other passengers, but none of them seemed to notice the strange imagery. They remained as still as statues, their faces unreadable. Then the lights flickered. For a brief moment, the carriage was plunged into darkness, and in that instant, I saw them, reflections in the window, distorted and wrong, hands with too many fingers, faces stretched into grotesque shapes, shadows that didn't match the figures casting them. The lights returned, and the carriage was as it had been. But the air felt heavier, the shadows deeper. I gripped the edges of my seat, my pulse hammering in my ears. I didn't know where this train was going, but one thing was certain. I wasn't alone. The oppressive silence inside the carriage weighed on me like a physical force. Every creak of the train felt magnified, every flicker of the lamps casting monstrous shadows along the walls. The other passengers sat as though frozen, their faces blurred by a distortion that seemed to ripple in the air around them. I wanted to ask them something, anything, but my throat felt tight, as though the atmosphere itself had stolen my voice. Then the conductor appeared. He emerged from the far end of the carriage, his tall, gaunt frame shrouded in a dark uniform that seemed stitched from shadows. His face was pale, almost skeletal, his eyes deep hollows that held a faint, unnatural glow. He moved with unnerving precision, each step deliberate, as if he were part of the train itself. I gripped my ticket tightly as he approached. The faint sound of metal scraping metal accompanied his movements, though I saw no source for the noise. "Ticket," he said, his voice hollow and echoing, as if spoken from a great distance. I held out the yellowed card with trembling fingers. The conductor's bony hand took it, his touch unnaturally cold, like ice against my skin. He examined the ticket briefly before punching it with a strange device that hissed like steam escaping a pipe. As he handed it back, he leaned closer, his hollow eyes locking onto mine. "You'll need this," he whispered, his breath cold and metallic. "For the stop." Before I could respond, he turned sharply and moved to the next passenger. His words echoed in my mind. "For the stop." What stop? Where was this train even going? The train jolted suddenly, the movement throwing me back into my seat. The lamps flickered again, their dim glow struggling against the encroaching shadows. The train picked up speed, the faint rumble beneath my feet growing stronger, more frantic. I glanced out the window, desperate for a sense of direction, but what I saw chilled me to my core. The fleeting images outside had grown sharper, more vivid. They weren't just places. I recognized them. The park where I used to play as a child, its swings swaying gently in an unseen breeze. The house I'd grown up in, its windows glowing faintly with the warmth of old memories. The hospital room where I'd spent hours by my grandmother's bedside, the sound of her shallow breaths hauntingly clear. These weren't random scenes. They were my memories. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass, staring out as the train sped through the fragments of my past. Each one lingered just long enough to stir a flood of emotions, nostalgia, regret, sorrow, before dissolving into the void. Familiar, isn't it? The woman across from me spoke again, her sharp teeth glinting faintly in the dim light. I turned to face her, my pulse racing. "What is this?" I demanded, my voice cracking. "Where are we going?" She tilted her head, her smile widening unnaturally. "This train doesn't travel to destinations. It travels through lives." She gestured toward the window, her movements smooth and almost serpentine. "Every turn of the wheel pulls us deeper into who you are, your past, your regrets, your sins." I stared at her, my breath catching in my throat. "That's impossible," I whispered. Her laughter was soft, chilling. "Impossible? You'll find that here, impossible is just a word." She leaned back, her face slipping into shadow. "You'd best be ready. The train never stops unless you make it." Her words clung to me like cobwebs, refusing to be brushed away. "The train never stops unless you make it." My pulse hammered in my ears as I turned the thought over and over. What did she mean? How could I stop a train that seemed to operate outside the boundaries of logic? The flickering lights grew dimmer, the shadows stretching and writhing as though alive. I stood, gripping the edge of my seat for balance, and made my way toward the front of the carriage. The other passengers didn't react as I passed, their blurred faces frozen in eerie calm. The air grew heavier as I neared the door to the next carriage, each step harder than the last. I pushed it open, the hiss of escaping steam greeting me like a warning. The next carriage was identical to the first, red velvet seats, dim lamps, and silent passengers. But there was something different about the atmosphere. It felt colder, more hostile. Halfway through, the train jolted again, and I stumbled. The conductor appeared out of nowhere, his skeletal grin wider than before. "Going somewhere?" he asked, his voice a low hiss. "I'm just looking for the engine," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. The conductor tilted his head, his glowing eyes narrowing. "The engine is not for passengers." "I need to stop this train," I blurted, my voice trembling. For a moment he was silent, the shadows around him thickening. Then he chuckled, a dry, raspy sound that sent chills down my spine. "Stop it," he repeated, his voice dripping with mockery. "You cannot stop what has already begun. The train moves because you made it move." "I don't understand," I said, taking a step back. "You will," he said. "Soon." He vanished as suddenly as he'd appeared, leaving behind a faint smell of smoke and decay. I pressed on, my determination growing despite the gnawing fear in my chest. The next door led to a narrow corridor filled with exposed pipes and gears. The sound of the train's mechanisms was deafening here, a cacophony of grinding metal and hissing steam. At the end of the corridor, I saw it. The engine room. A heavy metal door barred the way, its surface etched with strange, glowing runes. I reached for the handle, my hand trembling, when the woman's voice echoed behind me. "You'll need this." I turned to see her holding a small silver key, her smile as sharp as ever. "Use it wisely," she said, placing it in my hand. Before I could ask what she meant, she vanished, leaving me alone with the door and the suffocating weight of what lay beyond. The silver key felt heavy in my hand, far heavier than its size should allow. The faintly glowing runes on the metal door seemed to shift and writhe as though alive, their light pulsing in time with the train's ceaseless churning. I hesitated, my breath fogging the cold, acrid air. Every instinct screamed for me to turn back, to flee, but the woman's words echoed in my mind. Use it wisely. With trembling fingers, I inserted the key into the lock. The moment it turned, the runes flared brilliantly, bathing the corridor in blinding light. The door creaked open, revealing the engine room, a cavernous space far larger than the train should have been able to hold. Inside, the air was thick and suffocating, vibrating with an unnatural hum that resonated deep within my chest. The room was dominated by a massive, pulsing heart of machinery, an intricate web of twisting gears, churning pistons, and glowing pipes that snaked through the darkness like veins. At its center, suspended within a translucent sphere, was a molten, blood-red core that seemed alive, throbbing with an irregular rhythm. I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing against the metal floor. The whispers began immediately, soft at first, like the murmurs of distant voices, but quickly rising in volume, overlapping into a maddening cacophony. You shouldn't be here. It's too late. Stay, stay. The sphere pulsed brighter, its light spilling into every shadowed corner of the room. I took a step closer, squinting against the glow, and saw something moving within the core. Shapes writhed in its depths, elongated figures, their limbs unnaturally long, their faces distorted in silent screams. You've come to break the cycle. The conductor's voice cut through the noise like a blade. I turned to see him standing in the doorway, his skeletal grin impossibly wide. He seemed taller now, his hollow eyes blazing with a malevolent light. Do you even know what you're doing? He hissed, stepping toward me. The metal floor groaned beneath his feet. This train exists because of you. Every regret, every sin, every shadow of doubt. This is your creation. You're lying, I said, though the tremor in my voice betrayed my uncertainty. Am I? He sneered, gesturing toward the sphere. Look closer. See the truth you've tried to bury. I didn't want to look, but my gaze was drawn to the core, as though it had a will of its own. The shapes within became clearer. People I knew, their faces twisted in agony. My parents, who I'd ignored in their time of need. My best friend whom I'd betrayed. A stranger I could have helped but didn't. No, I whispered, stumbling backward. This is your legacy, the conductor said, his voice a low growl. And now you want to stop it? Foolish. I gripped the key tighter, my knuckles white. How do I end this? The conductor's grin faltered, a flicker of something unreadable passing through his hollow eyes. You can't, he said, though his voice wavered. Unless what? I demanded, stepping closer. He hesitated, then gestured toward the sphere. Destroy the core, but be warned, if you fail, the train will continue forever, and you will be part of it, bound to its endless journey. The weight of his words settled over me, suffocating and cold. I looked at the core again, the red light now pulsing erratically, as if it could sense my intentions. I have to try, I said, my voice trembling. The conductor said nothing, his form dissolving into shadows that lingered at the edges of the room. I approached the core, its heat searing my skin even from a distance. Lifting the silver key, I struck the sphere with all my strength. The impact sent a shockwave through the room, and the whispers rose into a deafening roar. The core writhed, its light flickering violently as cracks began to spiderweb across its surface. The figures inside screamed silently, their forms writhing in agony. The machinery around me groaned, gears grinding and pipes bursting as the train seemed to fight back. With one final strike, the sphere shattered. The light exploded outward, engulfing everything in a blinding, searing radiance. The whispers ceased abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence. When I opened my eyes, I was standing on the platform. The train was gone, the tracks covered in frost. The yellowed ticket disintegrated in my hand, scattering like ash in the wind. The sun was rising, its light pale and cold, but something lingered. A faint hum in the air. The shadows cast by the morning light seemed darker, sharper. As I turned to leave, I swore I heard it, a faint, distant whistle echoing from nowhere. I never stepped onto a train again.